Welcome to Talk Real Media's Taboo Podcast, where we talk about the shit that unites us. I am your host, M. Mays, and I'd like to thank you for supporting independent journalism. Grateful that you are joining us here as part of the May We Prevail mental health campaign, and for this edition of Matters of Mental Health. Today's guest is a fellow warrior queen. Her and I met through migraine-related functions. She is a fierce advocate in the world of head pain and rare disease. So much so that it was, in fact, Dr. G who helped me come to terms with some of my own limitations. Back then, it was the acceptance of my need at times for a cane to be used as needed for limited mobility. Dr. Melissa Garrity is a licensed clinical health psychologist and CEO of Phoenix Rising with Dr. G. She specializes in chronic pain, complex medical, and eating disorders. Dr. Garrity lives with many complex medical diagnoses herself, such as the rare disease tethered cord syndrome. Dr. Garrity has received recognition and awards for her clinical excellence and advocacy efforts in the chronic pain community. She also enjoys presenting workshops to healthcare professionals and the public at an international level. A quick disclaimer is that she's not being featured on this particular segment to provide any official medical advice. So welcome, Dr. G, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your very busy schedule to be here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It is such an honor, my dear friend, to do this with you. I'm really excited for our talk today.
I think it's going to be great, and there's no limit, I think, to what we're going to be discussing or to the extent that it can help others who are listening. So thank you so much.
Absolutely. Unfiltered, right?
That's right. That's right. The only way to be. Well, in this case.
Yes.
I want to set a little bit of the groundwork for this conversation by elaborating a bit as to what the concept of a phoenix means. So as I looked it up, it is technically defined as being a unique bird that burns itself and rises from the ashes with renewed youth to live through another cycle. Also thought to be either a person or thing that is regarded as uniquely remarkable in some respect. So real quick, Dr. G, what do the words phoenix and rising mean to you personally?
Oh, yes, so important. Over my life as a rare disease patient, chronic illness patient, and also as a psychologist, I've personally and professionally experienced a lot of crashes and burns and then pulling myself up out of that. And so to me, this image and this representation that I built my brand around, this phoenix just is unwavering. Like the phoenix will just crash in a fiery blaze. And, for me, that can represent getting a new medical diagnosis or struggling with a flare in any of my symptoms or, just struggling with depression again. And so you're in that fire, you're in the midst of it, and it can be really hard to see. And then when those ashes are there, you kind of rise and you decide, all right, I'm going to own this experience. This is what happened. It doesn't mean I like it, but I'm going to move forward. And what can I do to make sure I'm living my values? And the beautiful symbolization, if that's the word, it is now, of this phoenix is that it's not just a one and done. Like as most chronic pain patients and chronic illness patients, like we're always having new symptoms or new diagnoses or new things. And so it allows us to have that sort of resilience of like, we can always go in a blaze and then like come through. And I really just love that symbolism.
Absolutely. How beautiful. Me too. I like the terminology you use, the crashes and the burning. And I like how you mentioned that you sort of had to get yourself up off the ground so to speak, it really does ultimately boil down to kind of rescuing ourselves, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, of course, we can ask for help, but at the end of the day, we're the ones who have to implement the resources and the coping skills because we're the ones who can rescue ourselves. And yeah, I agree.
I personally feel as though, and this isn't to be morbid by any means, but that I have had to die to myself many times over, and sometimes very literally on a daily basis. Can you relate to that?
Oh my goodness, yes. Sometimes, especially with our conditions, it could be like every minute, it's like you're struggling and have to be reborn again and whatnot. So yeah, you have to, it's exhausting. And I think people don't recognize how mentally and physically exhausting it is to live with chronic illnesses. It is literally minute by minute, things can change so drastically, and it's constantly having to have that resilience to reevaluate moment by moment what you can or can't do or what you should or should not do. It's a lot on a person.
Definitely. And, that whole take it a moment at a time, it sort of can sound like, depending on where you are mentally, right? It can sound a little bit like a cliche, but the truth is life really only happens a moment at a time, a breath at a time. So that's very literally the way that we're living anyway. I guess it kind of boils down to whether or not we are open and receptive to that, or if maybe we're fighting against the flow.
Yeah, absolutely. I do feel that, like, for some people, especially if they're not in a certain headspace, can feel like that's so cliche. And this moment is like the worst moment ever. But what I try to tell people is that, luckily for us, emotions and physical symptoms ebb and flow. So even when we're experiencing our worst moment, history and experience of ourselves has taught us, okay, in the next moment, or maybe a few days from now or whatever it is, things are going to shift and change. So we physiologically just can't be in that same moment forever. Like there's just so much ebb and flow, even if it's subtle.
That is such a valid and valuable point. I'm so glad that you mentioned that. And so as someone who works in the medical field, as well as being a patient yourself, as you mentioned, I'm very curious as to what your sort of well-rounded view, because you have it from all these different angles, right? So I'm curious about your view as well as what your quote-unquote definition is of mental health.
That last part cut off. Did you say of mental health?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Yes, of mental health. So your kind of view on it and how that, equivalates to what your definition is. Each of us have sort of a different definition or a different idea. So I'm curious about what yours is relating to mental health.
Such a great question. A lot of people will talk about the distinct differences between physical health and mental health. And while I understand that, I really view it as just health. Like, it's like health is the umbrella of all these, and they, mental health and physical health are equally important and should be addressed as such, and it shouldn't be like a one or the other kind of thing. So for mental health particularly, I look at it as, our personal well-being, how we're coping or not coping so well with situations in our life, how we're relating to our body, how we're relating to other people, how our thought patterns are throughout the day, and if we're living our values or not. I think we can be greatly impacted if we're just feeling like we're going all the time, but aren't like feeling like we're getting feeling like we're living richly by our values. And so I really think that values and mental health are very much interconnected. And in value speak, of course, we can't always do the things that we want to do. We have some obligations in life, such as maybe family, work, those things, and those things can absolutely be values. But what I see is sometimes if people over-focus on certain aspects of their life that they feel they must do to the neglect of living those values, those things they care about, that's when more anxiety, depression, things like that can become elevated.
So true. Physical health versus mental health, it's not a versus, right? Because it is so true what you said about it all being equally important as well as connected. All things sort of blend into as well as impact one another, whether that's for better or worse.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
You are someone who, by trade and your profession, you hold space for others during some of their most difficult moments and transitions through life. I just want to take a moment and give some space to how big of work that is and how important the way that you show up in the world and offer that to others is. I highly, highly value that, and thank you for the work that you do.
Thank you.
How do you, is it difficult to balance your own well-being with that of your clients and patients?
It absolutely is, especially as someone who has, over 30 medical diagnoses. It has been particularly difficult for me these past 2.5 years since I had COVID in March 2020, before masks, before shutdown, before anything. And before that, I was just trotting along doing my private practice and speaking engagements and all those things I loved. And then there was a great shift for me after I had got COVID. 6 months prior to that, I had just had neurosurgery for my tethered cord syndrome, and 10 days after the neurosurgery, I had an internal surgical repair for a CSF leak. So, recovery for both of those is already a long thing. And then to be hit with getting COVID in March 2020 after I was just in the beginnings of my recovery was really difficult for me physically and mentally, and still continues to be. I was the first person that all of my medical team and family and friends knew who had COVID, naturally. And I think I was only the second person in my whole county to have COVID, which was so sad because I saw it coming as a chronic, a disabled person. I saw COVID's going to be coming. So I started to implement stuff in my office, special cleaning protocols. I no longer was hugging patients or shaking hands, which was hard for us, but just trying to be safe. And so I know exactly where I got COVID from because I wasn't going out places or anything. And it was just I was very, very ill. And then when long COVID happened, I kind of sat back, as most disabled people did, and just thought to ourselves, people have no idea what's coming. Everyone thinks that if you're sick, you go to the doctor, you get treatment, and you get better. People don't recognize that there's horrible diseases such as ME, also known as CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome, which I had before COVID. And so then having that and then getting long COVID has really been difficult for me to make space for patients when I'm struggling so much myself. And in these last 2.5 years, it has made me question not wanting to do this anymore, not wanting to be a therapist anymore because I'm so mentally and physically exhausted. So that's one of the reasons why I started Phoenix Rising with Dr. G. There's been a couple times where I've had to cut my patient load drastically the last 2 years because I'm just so ill. And even just the past couple of weeks, it's been worse, but just struggling more with depression, where it is really difficult to know I have to hold space for patients because I really care about the patients I have. but really the past 2.5 years, everyone's mental health has been heightened. So prior to COVID, I had never had any patients attempt their life. And then within like a 2-month stretch, I had 3 patients attempt their life. I mean, of course, I've had, especially given the populations I work with, I've had people have suicidal thoughts and suicidal ideations and plans, but then we work with that, if they have to go to the hospital or we have to up our treatment. Like, that's always been a thing. But for me personally, as a clinician doing this for over 13 years, I hadn't personally experienced that. So we're in a pandemic and people attempted suicide, and then the mental health resources were less, where some of my patients were sitting for days in emergency rooms because there wasn't bed placements in mental health hospitals because, again, mental health has been, just more devastated than usual. So it's been really, really difficult, where it's hour after hour after hour. I could have 6-7 hours in a row of patient trauma while I'm struggling to breathe due to my long COVID symptoms, have all my normal pain stuff on top of that. So that's my very long-winded way of saying it's been extremely, extremely rough.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that. I know that it has been a rough time. It's been a rough time for a lot of us. I can definitely second the difficulties within the last couple years or so. It's been extremely challenging, and I think it's a meaningful point that you made that at this time in history, mental health is a topic that more people are sensitive to and are beginning to understand, perhaps more than ever before, because of what we've been going through on a collective scale. And so that makes me feel that it's a valuable time to be alive and be doing this work, even though it takes about everything that we have, but, we got what it takes.
Absolutely.
So I'll lovingly say that at the point of 30 medical diagnoses, I would stop counting.
I did. That was my stopping.
Yeah, I'm done. I'm done. Add on whatever else you want, whatever. They all blend into each other at this point anyway. But I want to touch on that concept of burnout and depression a little bit because it's really important, and I don't want to skip over
Absolutely.
I feel we'd be remiss if we didn't dive into that a little bit. So obviously COVID-19 has been difficult on mostly all of us. But what I have noticed is it has been very, for very different reasons, right? So something that I personally found interesting, and I'm curious about your take on this too. Being a chronically ill person, we already are unfortunately used to the whole kind of being shut in, unable to do the things that we want, follow through on engagements or commitments that we try to make, or see the people that we care about. So it's a valuable point to make that long COVID, it's important that people realize the extent that all of this can still impact a person long after it has, quote unquote, kind of come and gone. And I think it's an invitation to take a deeper dive into how we are showing up for others in the world, because so much of what we endure as human beings is technically invisible, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think the well-being of providers in general is often overlooked, and that's a bit of a disservice because it's like you went to school, right? You got trained for this. So you, as the provider, are just supposed to know everything and have all the answers and always be okay. But I feel this is an extremely dangerous mindset that kind of belittles the individual and almost holds them to an impossible and unrealistic standard. So what is something people should know about their approach to the members on their care team? What is something you wish was more acknowledged or understood in this regard?
Yes. Oh my gosh. Yes, on all accounts. And there's so many facets of you know, for a personal example, like I feel like I am so busy and exhausted with my work that I don't feel like I have the mental or physical energy to see my own psychologist. And so, and since I am considered an independent contractor, I don't get paid when I don't work. So, you know, I think there's that facet for a lot of private practice practitioners of, you know, they almost feel like, well, if, you know, I don't work, I don't get paid to take care of my medical bills, you know, for us people who have chronic illnesses. I also think there is definitely this complex of people thinking that, you know, we don't deal with the same stuff that everyone else deals with. And the thing is, you know, no one has taught any of us how to live through a pandemic. And then no one has taught therapists how to be therapists during a pandemic, or medical doctors and medical students how to do all that in a pandemic. It's kind of like we're having to take our resources and our resilience and learn as we go and adapt as we go. And yeah, maybe we're, you know, able to do that because of our rigorous trainings have kind of taught us that, but it's also kind of a go to the detriment of us. So many healthcare professionals, particularly nurses, are leaving healthcare. It hasn't been till, like I said earlier, till this, you know, this past couple years that I've thought about not being a psychologist in this like one-to-one therapy anymore. And that's just devastating to hear me say, because I had never thought that before. And I know a lot of other healthcare professionals feel the same thing, that we're just so exhausted and feel like, you know, at the beginning of the pandemic, especially for nurses and doctors, it was like, oh, thank you, you're amazing. You know, we're going to cheer when you get off your shifts, and pizza parties for all. And then as the pandemic kept going, it just started turning into, you know, people not believing what doctors and nurses and qualified people are saying about the pandemic and safety and all of that. And it's just escalated, where that just adds to the burnout of just not feeling appreciated, not feeling respected, overworking yourself, in many instances for many people in conditions that are, you know, institutionally not conducive to mental health and wellness. So I think overall it's been just a really big struggle for healthcare professionals.
So true. You know, I came across a quote not too long ago, and it's written in relation to employment specifically. And it says, don't spend 8+ hours a day or 40+ hours a week making others' dreams come true and then come home and not invest into your own. So to rephrase or to reframe that a little bit, we could reflect upon it as, you know, not investing into everyone else's health and well-being while leaving ourselves behind. You know, you're so right that no one taught us how to get through this pandemic. I mean, we couldn't possibly have ever known what we didn't know, right? And I remember that the healthcare providers were being acclaimed as heroes, which I most certainly agree. Yep. But that has sort of seemed to fade. And instead of showing up for each other and being more supportive, I feel we are generally, as a society, sort of dropping the ball a little bit in that regard. And there's still a lot that all of this can teach us if and when we are willing to be receptive to learning.
Absolutely. Yeah, I completely agree. And I see that a lot, especially like on med Twitter. I see a lot of healthcare professionals trying to support each other, which I've seen an elevation of that over the last 2 years, so that's really encouraging and great. But I really don't think people understand how could they understand what it's like to be met with trauma after trauma after trauma for, 6 to 12 hours, depending on, where you work. And then when you're done with that, you're just depleted and don't have anything left. Like, I mean, I haven't seen my best friend in person. I don't know how long it's been. Like that, you know, like I don't have much else to give to my family or friends. And I pretty much just, especially with like long COVID, like, and all my other symptoms, you know, for my other diagnoses, I pretty much just am living to see patients and then breaking down with all my symptoms, having to try to rest and pace, and then doing it again. And then just again and again and again, while I'm also, you know, trying to start my business in hopes that I can, you know, just try to have a more balanced life. But it's very much a struggle.
I think it's important, you know, that kind of kindness and the gentleness that we, you know, extend to so many others, and I know you do in your practice. You know, I think it's important to reserve a little bit of that tender, loving care for ourselves. And one point I want to make is that, you know, we know this well as being chronically ill. We know this as our symptoms evolve through the years, and we might even get more, you know, more unwell or add more conditions to the list and what have you. Attempting to go back to the Phoenix that you were, you know, last year around this time, right, or whenever, isn't really possible, you know. And I think when we fall to those ashes, we sometimes try to put the pieces together in the same ways that they were before, and that can be really disheartening. It can be really heartbreaking, right, because we don't want to, you know, let go of these parts of ourselves, so to say. But what I'm hearing through your sharing, and this is really beautiful, is that, you know, you're moving with the times. You are self-reflecting and taking stock of, you know, where am I at? What am I able to do? How am I able to do it for the sake of my own self and showing up for other people? And I think that's really important because we can spend years, weeks, months, sometimes the duration of our whole lifetime trying to get back to the person that we were before whatever happened that changed us. And so, again, it kind of comes to that ebb and flow that you mentioned earlier about, you know, are we going to kind of take a look around and see what we can do with where we are and what we have? Or are we going to fixate on the past we wish we could go back to or the way we want to see the future? And are we going to allow these present moments to continually slip by? Because that's kind of a waste of a life in the grand scheme. You know, I don't mean to belittle wherever anyone is at. You know, it's definitely a process. But, you know, we just do ourselves a disservice, I think, when we attempt to fit a square into, you know, a triangle hole. You know what I mean?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And thank you for saying that. I agree completely with all of this that has happened since I personally had COVID. Like, it actually, as odd as it sounds, a lot of great stuff has come out of the last 2 years for me. I've recognized things that weren't of service of me, but I didn't even know they weren't in service of me because I was just doing my thing. For example, like the last 2.5 years, I am now fully working from home. And that is something that I never thought that wasn't even on my radar. Like, occasionally I did like telehealth sessions with people. I've always offered that, which is great for the chronic pain community. But I always like kind of went into the office most of the time to do those before COVID. And not having to drive and go to the office definitely saves a lot of physical energy for me, and has been really important for me to reevaluate my life in those ways. Similarly with, you know, I remember one of the really dark times early on when I was sick with COVID. I was on the couch at like 4 a.m. and I really thought I was having a heart attack or something. I kind of had felt like, well, I'm not going to call 911 because I don't want to deal with medical gaslighting. I had already been sent to the emergency room a bunch of times by my doctors, and they can't help me because I'm not only, admitting people who are pretty much almost dying, so they're not going to help me anyway. So I'm sitting here thinking of all this stuff, and just knowing that, something's got to give. I have to, drastically change. And that's kind of where my strength from Phoenix Rising comes from, and your lowest low, and you're just something's got to give. What can I make of this? And so that's really where Phoenix Rising with Dr. G was born in the coming weeks after that. And then I officially launched it earlier this year or whenever it was. But with all of this too, to your other points, I heavily practice acceptance. That is something that has saved me. Acceptance not meaning rolling over and giving up, but acceptance in the empowerment of, this is my current situation. I don't like it, but what can I do about it? And if there's nothing I can do about it, can I accept it and do something to take care of myself? And so it's been a struggle, specifically, after my neurosurgery with the CSF leak, and then with long COVID on top. It's not, acceptance is a thing you constantly are striving for, and it's not a one and done again. And there was points after my neurosurgery and at the beginning of long COVID where I didn't want to physically be on the earth anymore. I just was so mentally exhausted and physically exhausted of I have to rebuild myself yet again. Every one of my 30-some diagnoses, you just, okay, now I have this, now I have to adapt this, now I have to get used to these disabling symptoms, and no medication helps me because my body rejects everything. It's always been, addition after addition after addition. And I think even the strongest of us, we get exhausted after a while with that. So it's been really a test of my skills, my coping skills, and my acceptance that I've been met with, particularly these last 2 years.
Wow, I'm so glad that you said that. I'm not glad that you've experienced it, but I feel to my core every word that you just shared. It's an important point, I think, to make, that lack and desire of remaining on this earth goes back to the ebb and flow, and that's part of why this campaign exists. That's part of why we're having this conversation to begin with, is that we're trying to, break through and change the narrative and break down the stigma, because, we're all human, and can we meet each other on that human level? Could we start looking at that idealization, or kind of almost that fantasy of, it'd be nice if I didn't have to feel this pain anymore type thing. Can we look at that as a symptom, just like we do a fever or a cough or what have you, that kind of comes and goes, and we can treat it lovingly and maybe respond to the bottom layer kind of need that ideology and those feelings are stemming from, It can seem like we are helpless when all is burning around us, but that's actually where we can rediscover, or perhaps discover for the very first time, our true power. Our current situation is not our final destination, right? And if we can't change the situation, perhaps we could shift the way we think about and or approach it. So that kind of takes me into one of the aspects to you, Melissa, that I adore and appreciate most. I mean, there's many, but this is just one of them. And that is your work as it pertains to mindfulness. Now, that is certainly a buzzword out here. It's thrown around a lot, okay? And in this day and age, let's just call it what it is, it can seem sort of privileged in its own sense, because not all of us lead a life that provides, ample time to just be present. And, the rest of us spend a lot of our energy and time actually, attempting to disregard or escape the present moments that we may be experiencing. So I'm curious, Melissa, how did you first kind of stumble upon that sort of practice, and how has it proven to be beneficial in your life?
Yeah, no, this is great. I first was really introduced to mindfulness when I was in my doctoral program. I worked at a place that did free therapy and free activities for people with cancer. It was an amazing practicum experience. And one of the therapists there, I was essentially our co-therapist, but for many sessions in group therapy, I would just observe her because, I was a student, I was learning. And she did this mindfulness group, and I learned so much from her. And then I started to expand more and more about mindfulness and chronic illness and cancer and chronic pain. And I really think that my mindfulness capabilities that I'm always, tuning, there's no right way or wrong way to do mindfulness, but I'll get to that in a moment. I really think that that's what has saved my life and has kept me going. And so when I hear people saying that are quick to dismiss mindfulness because of what they hear in pop psychology, it makes me want to scream and be like, no, wait, mindfulness isn't supposed to be peaches and rainbows and unicorns. It's about the real stuff. It's about being in that moment and seeing the good and the bad and everything and sitting with it. And that's super hard, especially with chronic illness, chronic pain. You ask someone, to sit with their stuff and they don't have the proper tools to do that. That can be really scary and really it can worsen things if they're taught it improperly. But really just to lean in and attend to my shit is helpful, because I like the analogy of so what happens when your chronic pain's building and you're trying to ignore it, you're trying to distract yourself. It's like dust under a rug. You keep piling it under. Well, eventually, the more you try to ignore and distract from your pain, eventually that dust is going to come flying out of the rug because there's nowhere else to go. And then all your other mental health symptoms can just explode around you. And so I think it's really important for us to attend as much as we can, to elevated physical symptoms, elevated mental health concerns, those sort of things in the moment. Just to be able to honor ourselves. And granted, again, there's a time and a place for it, right? If I'm in the middle of a session with a patient, I'm not going to be thinking about my own stuff and trying to attend to that. That's the patient time. But I can make a mental note and then know that I'm going to attend to it later, and then switch my attention and become more mindful in my session with my patient. So I think there's definitely there's a learning process and a learning curve, and it looks different for everyone. Someone who struggles with ADHD may have to approach mindfulness different from someone who has a lot of dissociation. There's different tools and different ways to utilize it, but I think it's been so watered down that of course people will say, oh, I've tried that, it didn't help me. Well, it's not about helping. If you go into mindfulness thinking it's going to, quote unquote, help you, cure you, make your pain go away, make your pain lessen, make your mental health symptoms lessen, then it's not going to happen. But if you go into it fully just being, maybe a byproduct will be that some of that stuff will lessen, or maybe it won't, and you'll just be able to figure out how can I take care of myself better in this moment. And I think that's the beauty of it. There's no expectations. It's just being.
That's right. I think that's really a valuable point to make, because a lot of times it's I'm supposed to silence my thoughts or, be with myself, when within myself is the very place I'm not trying to be, So I love the way you worded that. There really is no expectation, and that's exactly the point. I like that dust analogy too. Something else I thought of is how our thoughts, feelings, and symptoms, or what have you, is a lot like a laundry pile. It just keeps building up until we tend to it. So how high are we going to permit this mountain to be before we get to climb it,
Exactly.
Mindfulness is
and
something
then it just takes longer to deal with.
That's right, exactly. And we play a part in that, which is kind of tough to take ownership of sometimes, but also empowering if we choose to frame it that way, right? So it can be fairly easy to dismiss, right? Especially if I read an article, I took a few deep breaths, and I don't feel any better. But there's no right or wrong way to pursue it, as you mentioned. And the very definition of mindfulness can and does differ and vary per individual. I think sometimes we may get caught up, it's human nature, but what the next person might be doing, or the pop psychology, as you've mentioned. And we can become discouraged when our attempts at the same do not, exactly pan out. And it's okay for this to look however it needs to for you. In fact, that's the only way that it can ever become real in a person's life, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
That and, forming somewhat of a disciplined practice with it. So I'm not sure about you, Melissa, but I often get remarks such as, Mia, I don't know how you do it. Mia, you are so much stronger than I could ever be, et cetera, okay? And there's almost sometimes an underlying element of envy, which I find borderline comical, because it's like, if y'all only knew, I guarantee you would take it back. You would take it all back. It's just more often than not skipped over how much work all of this actually is, and that could be a reason that some throw in the towel on it before they even really get started. But it most certainly requires a switch to be turned on or off, depending on how you look at it, I guess, in your brains that permit a reprogramming of sorts. I personally believe that we enter the world mindful. We kind of see it in kiddos.
Oh, yeah.
But then our upbringings, our traumas, just life in general, strips us of that simplicity, and our perceptions as well as our brain chemistry gets altered as a result.
Absolutely.
So what is a tangible and accessible way for someone to begin exploring these concepts for themselves, like right now in this very moment?
Yeah, I think the most accessible way, something that we all have, is just our breath, just noticing our breathing, not trying to change it, noticing the pattern, noticing if there is not a pattern, if our chest is going up and down, or our stomach's rising and falling with the breath. If we're making any sounds when we're breathing, if we, notice that we're having the thought that this is stupid comes up, and then we go back to looking at our breathing, just really with the basics of the basics is your breath, and not trying to change it, just observing and just being with that. Another of the basics is, looking for 5 different colors in a room. Can you hear 4 different sounds? Can you touch 3 different things? Can you smell 2 different things? Can you taste one thing? Just very basic mindfulness grounding sort of things, just to start to connect with our environments and ourselves a little more.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. So there could be some out there listening who still aren't quite clear as to what we're talking about. They're not quite connecting with it, perhaps.
Yeah.
So I'd like to give them a quick example, Dr. G. So choose any instance that comes to mind that could or does happen to each of us as we're navigating through life. No pressure, just whatever pops in your mind first.
Something that we navigate, you said, right?
Yeah, just like a challenge or a hardship that, most people could probably relate to.
I think probably anxiety with a test.
Okay, perfect. So let's say that I'm about to take a test and I'm feeling very anxiety-ridden. So this is my first response, okay? This is my default response. I'm not going to be able to do this. I feel so stressed. I can't think straight. I'm forgetting everything that I studied. Nothing ever really goes my way anyway. Why is this teacher out to get me? Okay? That's response one. Response two is I'm taking a deep breath. I'm acknowledging what I'm feeling. I'm feeling pretty anxious right now, but you know what? I did study. I did take my time with that. I'm going to settle into my body. I'm going to do my absolute best on this test, one question at a time, and everything is going to be okay. You know, just describing that in words. And again, that was just, a hypothetical example, but Can you hear the difference? Because I can feel the difference, even though it's hypothetical. My body, you know what I mean? The heart rate, the sweating, as opposed to the relaxation and the just kind of being one with my body, So it wouldn't be a matter in this instance of like dismissing or ignoring the anxiety, because that can heighten it, right? But rather coexisting with it, right?
Exactly. Yeah, we can't control our thoughts, but what we can control is our actions. So we can't be like, in this example of a test, oh my gosh, I'm so anxious and like all these thoughts and I can't believe I'm anxious. And now that I'm anxious, I can't even focus and stuff like that. It's more of like leaning in and going, okay, I'm anxious. I'm having all these thoughts that I'm going to fail and I'm not going to do well. Well, thanks, mind. Those aren't helpful to me in the moment, but I acknowledge you. I hear you. Let's take some deep breaths. What can I do? Can I read this one sentence, a couple times and get back on track? Like those sort of things. So it's often lots of little shifts that make up of this mindfulness stuff that we're talking about.
Absolutely. And again, it's kind of a conscious, deliberate, ongoing practice. It's not like you think some positive thoughts for a day and you're good to go. It's an ongoing, moment-to-moment kind of decision that we have to make, because our brain, the way we're wired and the way evolution has worked, is always going to kind of default to the more negative state of mind. And that's been kind of a survival mechanism up until now, right? So it's not a matter of, downplaying ourselves or getting down on ourselves about that. It's just the acknowledgement piece and moving in that, I feel personally that mindfulness is a gift. It's a gift to ourselves and thereby the world. When we are operating from a heightened state of conscious awareness, the way we approach inwardly as well as outwardly changes for the better. I mean, let's just take a moment and imagine if the norm was that we approached one another with this sort of compassionate empathy. What if we were to extend that same grace toward ourselves? I feel that many of the problems we're faced with in the current day that are, limiting our growth and our evolution as a species would greatly improve, if not completely dissipate. And this is why we're encouraging everyone listening to take another, or perhaps your first ever look into all of this. But, we don't mean to convey that it's necessarily easy either, right, Dr. G?
Right, exactly. And everything you're saying, it is about learning how to be gentle with ourselves. And unfortunately, that's not something that we're taught when we're young. I think that all schools should have mindfulness, teachings and stuff. And I know some schools are starting, which is amazing to hear. There's this one urban school, I think in New York, that instead of sending kids to detention, they would have an hour of mindfulness trainings. Like how amazing is that? And one thing I kind of want to address, a little off topic, but kind of on topic still, is, it's about that compassion of a lot of us will be like, oh, I have so many negative thoughts and I wish I could just have positive thoughts and I'm such a negative Nancy. And it's about, again, leaning into having that self-compassion of trying to reframe that there's really no such thing as negative thoughts or positive thoughts. We put those connotations on them, which creates baggage. But what if we looked at it as like unhelpful thoughts or helpful thoughts? It kind of, takes out that negative connotation a little bit of like, okay, again, with the test example, if I'm having all these thoughts that I'm going to fail, well, that's not a helpful thought in the moment. And I'm noticing that. What can I do? And it's not like toxic positivity of like, I'm going to pass this test and everything's going to be great. Like, that's not realistic. If that helps some people, that's great. But for most of us, myself included, fake cheerleading myself isn't going to help. So it's like, what can I control in this moment if I'm doing this test? I can try to work on my breathing. I can try to, go in my memory bank and see what I can pull. Like, those are the things I can do.
That's right. I love that you brought that up, the whole negative versus positive. We need to stop labeling. Those are words for me personally in my life. I have, my language has changed a lot through my journey of this pet practice that we're talking about. And those are two words right there that I try to avoid, Also, I wanted to share this with you because I think you'll appreciate it, and maybe it'll help our listeners too. But you mentioned earlier about really kind of reaching that dark place to the point that you're like, man, what am I even doing on this earth, or do I even want to be on this earth? And I'll be sharing more about this at a different time this month, but I definitely reached that point not even all that long ago. And so a relatively new concept that I've been toying with is choose your hard, okay? It is hard to live in this space where I fight against myself. And it's also difficult to redistribute my energy and attention span. So we get to decide, right? Going back to what you said, what we can do. We get to decide what's most helpful in this moment and what would best serve me in this moment, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's beautifully said. It's not easy. None of this is. It's about just trying and trying again and doing your best, putting your all into trying again, putting that commitment to yourself, knowing that you are worth it. And again, I say that, but that's because I've had a lot of practice over the years to get to a point where I can say that. I understand that not everyone's there. I see a lot of people with eating disorders who are completely disconnected from their bodies and don't like themselves, physically, mentally, any of that. So that takes building and time and learning how to, be self-compassionate, but it's possible. It just looks different for everyone and takes time. Again, it's not something that happens overnight. It's often a long time of small shifts that allow a person to be able to become more self-compassionate to themselves, learn how to say no, learn where they want to invest their energy. It is a learning process for sure.
Absolutely. Self-work, the inner healing, the acknowledging our challenges, the difficulties, the hardships. As humans, we attempt to escape all that by really any and all means necessary. And that dates all the way back to when we had to look out for saber-toothed tigers making their way into our cave.
Exactly.
So
I use that example a lot, yes.
Yes, exactly. So it's important that no one takes any of this as if there's anything wrong with them or that they've been doing this whole life thing incorrectly, because we couldn't have known what we didn't know.
Exactly. One of my favorite books is The Happiness Trap by Dr. Russ Harris. I recommend that for all my patients, and a lot of us actually will do it in session because we can have such rich discussions. And it's just a beautiful way. And I laughed when you said the saber-toothed tiger, because that's an example in there of we are biologically programmed to just be reevaluating everything and on edge and comparing ourselves and doing all these things, and then we get stuck into that trap.
It's indeed a trap. We got to be careful not to trap ourselves. Life does a good enough job of tempting that on its own. But so, when you are being faced with this burning that we've been talking about and the kind of falling to ash yet again and again and again, in order to rise up like the phoenix that you are, is there a slogan a mantra, an affirmation, or some kind of other meaningful reflection that you cling to? I mean, what do you find most helpful during these difficult moments?
Yeah, my values, going back to my values, those things that are unchanging within me. So one of my values is education. So I love to learn and absorb as much information as I can, not just about like mental health topics, but animals and like astronomy. Like I have a whole bunch of little like areas that I really like learning about and being able to share those. So another one of my values is to be able to help and teach others. So when I'm down in those ashes and it's really, really a struggle to come up, it's pretty much my, education and teaching that lift me out of it, that get me motivated of, okay, well, what can I learn today and how can I share that with other people? It gets me going. It gets me living.
That is so special and very important that, sometimes when, our tunnel vision is caving in on us and we're just so wrapped up in what we are going through, like there's definitely a time and place to just stop, drop, tend to yourself, curl up in that ball, love on yourself, get through one moment to the next, But at a point, kind of unpacking and living in that muck, if you will stop serving us. And it definitely isn't necessarily serving anyone else. And so I think you and I definitely agree on the whole kind of like, let's try to focus on something bigger than ourselves when we can. Let's try to give back, right? I like to think about, the fact that maybe we've made it through these fires and now we're running out with buckets of water for others, whether it's, a bucket of education, a bucket of compassion, a bucket of empathy, fill your bucket, which you need to have something in your own bucket if you're gonna pour out, and that brings it all the way back around to what we've been saying. But, is there anything else that you wish to leave our listeners with today?
Yeah, I'm just taking a moment to reflect. I think we talked a lot about some really deep, good stuff. And I think that what I'd like to leave people with is try to find what's best for you. And that could be, maybe you don't know, and try things that maybe sound kind of odd, but you won't know if it's going to be something you like until you try it. Like, listening to podcasts like this, attending free seminars, those sort of things, reading about mindfulness, getting a copy of The Happiness Trap, like those sort of things to just kind of open your experiences to that self-compassion that you deserve.
Yes, and kind of starting there, like knowing that you deserve it, knowing that you are worth it, and that realization. We experience the duration of our entire life on the inside of ourselves. So we are our own best investment. That's something that you can afford. And these days, there's lots of free resources, including this podcast or YouTube or what have you. We have things at our fingertips these days that, more than ever before. So utilize that and realize that it's on us to really kind of be our own case study, our own science experiment, if you will.
Yeah.
And don't give up until you find something that works for you, and reach out, to get help if you need. So on that note, if someone were to want to follow up with you, Dr. G, how can they find you?
Yeah, so they could contact me through my website, Phoenix Rising with Dr. G. I'm sure you'll put it like in the notes of this podcast. And on my website, I have a contact me page. I also have a lot of free resources. On my one resource page, I have a ton of free videos, like of webinars I've done. I have one on mindfulness and chronic pain. I have all my articles, free access on there. And then I also have my social media handles on my website as well.
Thank you. I have so much gratitude for you, your experience, as well as your expertise. I know it hasn't been easy. I appreciate your vulnerability in showing up presently and sharing, and the fact that you've made it to this point. It's so beautiful the way that you pour yourself into others and walk alongside them throughout their journeys, despite your own having proven tremendously difficult at times. It's a sacred position to be in, but we need not leave ourselves or our own healing behind. We are deserving of the very same consideration and care that we extend to others. In fact, that is how we fill ourselves to ensure we've got an adequate place to pour from. If we all conducted ourselves a little bit more like you, Dr. G, not only could we alter the way of the world, but it is my belief that we could be able to save it. So thanks again so much for your precious time.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And everything you just said really touched me, and I hope you know that I feel the same way about you.
Thank you so much. I have no doubt many lives will be touched as a result of this segment. So please take loving care of yourself, my dear friend.
You as well.
Thank you. Namaste.